Without further ado, our next guest, Brother Brad Griffin. He's been in the battle a long time. One of the first people that I met in this business, and I've been at it a long time, longer than I'd like to say. His wife, Renee, they have two boys. His blog, Occidental Descent, and he wrote it down for me, and it's over there on the table. His Twitter account is
Luther and Joy.
Newfound Joy.
Luther,
like in Martin Luther.
Yeah, Luther and Joy is my Twitter.
Yeah, so he's going to talk with you some more about that. Also, he wrote a great article for our last newsletter, and so we were really honored to have him contribute that, and we're really honored to have him here today to talk with us. I think he's going to make some points that we can leave here with. We talked about solutions, and I think that his subject today will be big in that regard. Brad, thank you very much.
I would like to start off by thanking Mike and Ed for having me. Can you hear me? A little shorter than the previous speakers. Anyway, it has been a decade since I first spoke in this building. That was 2014. It was 10 years ago. In that speech called The Logic of Street Demonstrations, I gave 10 reasons why Southern nationalist activists were hitting the streets. After everything that has happened since then, I recently went back and read that speech, and now it feels like it was delivered by a different person almost a lifetime ago. We have traveled a great distance from the tranquil politics of the late Obama era. I don't know if you remember it, but things were just so much calmer in the last 2 years of Obama compared to like the last 8 years. Anyway, today I would like to share with you another list. It is the top 10 things that I've learned the hard way over the past decade as an activist. Specifically, it is a list of the traps and the pitfalls that I've seen activists in the nationalist space stumble into and harm themselves and their cause. Number one, activists have principles. Activists tend to be college-educated, middle-class radicals of above-average intelligence. And it is activists who have principles. The overwhelming majority of people in this world do not care about your principles. Politicians do not have principles. Ordinary people, they don't have principles. Even your fellow activists only share your principles to a greater or lesser degree. Now, hopefully, your mama loves you, but it's unlikely that even she shares 100% of your political principles. So, when we approach the political sphere, we must have realistic expectations. I'll start there. Activists make a mistake when they treat politicians and normal people like fellow activists. This often takes the form of activists getting frustrated and upset when politicians, being politicians, betray their principles, or when normal average people express their lack of interest in some pet obsession of an activist. This can lead to a cynical, negative attitude and contempt for politicians and normal people, which in the long run is self-defeating. It is not unusual for frustrated activists to storm out of the political arena and take their toys and go home. And they will forfeit the game and congratulate themselves on doing this because it's a moral victory. The job of the activist is to build public support for his cause and to nudge politicians to offer concessions. Your principles are only a guide to political engagement, not a reflection of political reality. That's the first mistake. Second, activists love purity spiraling. There are few things that activists enjoy more than purity spirals in which their 80% friends become their 20% enemies. This typically happens when the attention of the activist shifts from trying to influence the public and win concessions from politicians to a more self-absorbed focus on his own principles. Activists lose interest in the external world and become obsessed with expressing and displaying their principles to other activists. Other activists become the audience, when the audience should be politicians and ordinary people. Fidelity to one's principles and punishing any deviation from your principles will then take on a more religious tone as a test of personal piety and character. Saul Alinsky was correct to identify, quote, making the enemy live up to his own book of rules, end quote, as a major tactical weakness that radicals like himself can exploit. The easiest way to destroy an organization of activists is usually to get a good purity spiral going among them. You just place swords in front of activists and convince them that the principal thing to do is to dive headfirst on them. So that's mistake number 2. Number 3, activists go down rabbit holes. Are you based in red pill? If so, you have likely gone down a deep ideological rabbit hole. You have probably read dozens of books or listened to hundreds, perhaps thousands of hours of podcasts about some topic or another. You have educated yourself and have firm opinions about some topic which you want to share with others. You have become an activist who has seen through the myths and illusions of society that society puts in front of you, and now you grasp the truth. The truth, it can be about the Jews, it can be women, it can be about race, it can be about vaccines, the Federal Reserve. The topic doesn't matter. You can even be right in the sense that whatever it is that you've become so obsessed with and have spent so much time educating about yourself. The problem is that by going down such a deep ideological rabbit hole, it has a cost for the activist. It is like learning a new language or putting on a new pair of glasses with a strong prescription that you forget is there. It warps how you view the world, and it has an isolating effect. It becomes much more difficult and challenging to communicate with others who do not see the world as you do. And this can take a heavy toll on your personal relationships. Now, it is much easier for us to see how this plays out on the left with its woke jargon and its 10,000 new genders. Activist slogans like defund the police and abolish ICE have become political albatrosses, which are deeply out of touch with the sensibilities of the median voter. They have become anchors around the feet of politicians who bow to the demands of left-wing activists. Now, we laugh at the idiots who ruin franchises like Terminator or Ghostbusters by catering to the sensibilities of woke activists. You probably know a lot of people who have sworn off Bud Light since the Dylan Mulvaney fiasco. Now, the same phenomenon happens on the right when activists become socially isolated, segregated away from their peers in internet silos, where they develop their own jargon and cultural touchstones and are influenced by like-minded people who have similarly become out of touch with reality. It's harsh to say it, but it is a problem. I call this problem activist brain, and it comes across as weird to everyone else in society who's not traveled down the same 1,000-mile ideological rabbit hole. And as an activist, this is a liability which can cloud your judgment. Successful activists, in my view, need to develop a sense of self-awareness about this. They should not lose themselves in internet ghettos. And instead, they should try to remember who they were before they became red pill, if for no other reason to better interact with people outside your bubble. Number 4, this is a big one. Uniting activists is a mistake. In 2017, Jason Kessler, an activist from Virginia, came up with the idea for the Unite the Right rally. I was sold on the idea because it strongly appealed to my sense of honor. Many of us took the plunge, drove up to Charlottesville. And I went to Charlottesville for the same reason that I had traveled to other cities across the South, like New Orleans and Birmingham, to defend our Confederate monuments. The problem with Jason Kessler's ill-conceived Unite the Right rally was that it became a Unite the Activist rally. Various activist groups with different identities, different values, and missions came together to protest in Charlottesville, each one having gone down their own ideological rabbit hole and then paraded in front of the cameras. The result of that rally, as the years have passed, the more I think about it, is that the core message that we were trying to send that day got lost after a fight broke out with Antifa and one woman died. The most extreme activists made themselves the story. And the story was not the removal of the Lee and Jackson monuments, but a tendency of activists to become the lightning rod. Big mistake. The upshot of Charlottesville is that the fallout from that event weakened us. The Democratic Party is a coalition of activist groups, interests, and constituencies. It is a fundamental mistake to assume that the right is like the left and that tactics like popular fronts would impress a right-wing audience. Now, we doubled down on that mistake we made in Charlottesville with the Nationalist Front. We were trying to organize activists with different viewpoints. And the whole time we were doing that, we were losing sight of the audience we were trying to influence, which is a lot more moderate.
Question.
Yes.
Wasn't the main issue at Charlottesville the fact that the police didn't enforce the law?
That's true. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean, I'm not arguing that. That's absolutely the case. In fact, what happened in Charlottesville set the pattern for everything that followed, especially in 2020 when we went to Charlottesville and the police stood down. It was so outside of our experience that it was the first time that something like that had happened. But now it's something that's routine. But the thing that drew us there in the first place, the cause was that they were removing the Lee and Jackson monuments.
I know what you seem to be saying that's the main problem, but the main problem was the fact that the police didn't enforce the law.
I mean, I agree that's why the rally, I've always said that's why the rally went south, but the way Kessler organized it is like they're taking down these monuments so everyone from all across the country has to come there. And that was the magnet that drew us in. What I'm saying is that the reason we originally went was to make it about the monuments, but all the news coverage and everything all about was totally 100% about the activists who were there. And that kind of lost the message that we were trying to send. Number 5, Americans dislike activists. Americans are typically annoyed by activists. 7 years ago, I wasn't as sensitive to this fact as I am today. But Americans rarely approve of activist groups, even those which have the best optics and which are on the best behavior. And this is true across the political spectrum. While activists are necessary to bring about change, Americans have an instinctive dislike of disruption and usually respond negatively to it. Some of us might thought we looked cool by adopting the aesthetic of the Waffen-SS and shouting at Antifa across the street, but is rarely appreciated by anyone else except other radical activists. In fact, it is easier to stir up a backlash among Americans against activists because of this reflex than it is to persuade them to adopt the views of activists. It's a paradox. It's a problem for activists. It's easier to be an anti-activist than it is to be an activist. So as activists, we need to be very careful and mindful about the actions we take and how we are perceived both by our own people and those we are trying to influence. In retrospect, streaking through Charlottesville with the National Socialist Movement to see baked Alaska probably wasn't the best idea. 6, activists are in a hurry. In 2014, I was an activist who was in a hurry to engage in street demonstrations, to smash the taboos and force our views into the mainstream. Now, I still think we got off to a very strong start in that. I remain very impressed with our early work. We came across as white, Southern, Christian nationalists. The important thing is that we were striking the right balance between being, on the one hand, saying things that were edgy, and on the other hand, appearing normal and relatable enough that anyone who would see us think these guys are just people from our community. You could drive by our demonstrations and think, maybe these guys holding the signs out there that says that Marco Rubio wants to replace us, maybe they're a little out there, but they are onto something. And in that sense, we were an early and true vanguard because we were saying the things out loud that millions were thinking. Looking back on it, everything we were saying a decade ago is now part of the mainstream political conversation. This includes, unbelievably, our most controversial and signature idea, which is the desirability of a national divorce. Half of Trump supporters now support dissolving the union. It'd be great if they acted on it. White identity is reemerging on the right after decades of repression. Christian nationalism has flared up in our churches. The change was very gradual and almost imperceptible at first, but it has greatly accelerated over the past 5 years. Looking back on it, I think we became too impatient around the time that Donald Trump was elected president. This is where we began to go off the rails as activists. We inserted ourselves into the left-wing backlash against Trump. We made ourselves a target, and we absorbed the backlash at a great cost. Later, the street demonstrations subsided. We got out of the picture, and the public was able to focus squarely on BLM and Antifa. And there was a backlash against what is now called wokeism. Americans dislike activists. If we're not in the picture with BLM or Antifa, they come to hate those people. What I've learned from this is that there's no greater virtue that activists can cultivate than patience. Activists travel far ahead of public opinion, and our biggest challenge is how we handle that. 7, activists should focus locally. While the street demonstrations that I attended in the past were a lot of fun, Richard can attest to that, I quickly learned that there's nothing activists can do that is sustainable by driving 5 or 6 hours from city to city to meet up with our widely dispersed friends from the internet. Gathering activists from all across the country to descend on Charlottesville to attend a rally/festival, because a lot of people are going there for a party, was a mistake because there was nothing that outsiders could have done to save the Confederate monuments there. It was also a strange move for people who ought to know how decisions are made by state and local governments. None of us in this room probably are residents of Charlottesville, so we ultimately had no input on that decision. 8, activists confuse Twitter with real life. Write it down 100 times until you internalize this. In retrospect, I think the abrupt change in our activism from the Obama years to the Trump years was largely driven by the migration of activists to Twitter. In the span of 3 years, we went from fairly normal and presentable street activism with normal people from the South to wannabe gladiators from Los Angeles showing up at our events in Roman-style armor. That actually happened in New Orleans. It only got crazier from there because conflict and going viral on Twitter created toxic incentives for activists. The narcotic of becoming a minor internet celebrity is what led to events like the Spencer College Tour in Auburn and Unite the Right. Most of us ended up losing our accounts anyway in the end. I now look at the glory days of Twitter as the activist equivalent of eating a few gallons of tasty vanilla ice cream. It was a short-term rush of fake calories, and it was bad for the long-term health of our movement. 9, this is a big one. Activists that burn bright usually burn out the fastest. After a decade of activism, I've lost count of the number of people, many of them who I've seen walk through that door, who became extremely radical and intensely active for 2 or 3 years, but who then got disillusioned, who went dark, and who were never heard from again. It seems like the loudest, the most extreme activists are the ones who are the most likely to just flame out. In contrast, I've been struck by the fact that people who are more moderate, people like my father-in-law, Gordon Baum, who is like a happy warrior, are the ones who seem to stay the course and who remain active for years and years and decades and decades. They devote their entire lives to the cause, as opposed to a few years. 10, and this is the final one. Activists should not go outside the experience of other people. Finally, some of the biggest mistakes I've witnessed in my years as an activist, the things that created the worst publicity for us, which stoked the most division and subtracted from our ranks, can be summarized as things we did which went outside the experience of our people. Activists convinced themselves it was a great idea, and everyone else was just supposed to go along. But it struck other people as weird and unfamiliar, and it became a source of division and controversy, and in the long run, it weakened us. So, to sum up what I've said here today, activists should remain positive, patient, and pragmatic. You should always strive to balance edginess with normalcy. You should develop a greater sense of self-awareness about the ideological blinders you have on. You should focus on your own local area instead of building large social media accounts, which can be deleted on a whim. Avoid purity spirals. Try to see the best in people. Put the best construction on their character. And to forgive the small things that are just better let go. Avoid getting too radical. And avoid the equal mistake of getting in a hurry. And always keep the audience in mind, who are people who are much more moderate than us. Thank you.